I would say once you start, moving past 3 or 4 locations, moving to the cloud makes a lot more sense. But if you're just talking, one primary and, maybe a satellite location or two, I think it makes more sense to keep the hardware and keep it internal, and we can set up ways to get that data and make sure it's secure.
You're listening to Stimulus Tech Talk, a conversation based podcast created by Stimulus Technologies that covers a range of topics related to business and technology.
Welcome to Stimulus Tech Talk. I am Sherry Lip, Marketing Director at Stimulus Technologies, and I am here with Stimulus Technologies CEO, Nathan Whitaker. And today we are going to be talking about technical issues and technical things we need to do for multi-location dental offices. Welcome, Nathan.
Thanks, Sherry, and welcome everybody to the podcast today.
So, Nathan, we've kind of talked about tech for multi-locations before, but there are a lot of dental practices that have more than one office. So, what kind of tech challenges does that present? Is that different than just, do you think of them each as their own business, or is there something that puts them together?
We've seen it both ways. We've seen some dental practices that are owned by the same group that more or less run as completely separate practices. They have separate servers, separate software, and there's, completely separate systems between the two offices. Some advantages of that is it's just a lot easier. Each office can have their own equipment, own software, servers, everything like that. But the disadvantages for the patient and for the workers too is, you can't easily transfer charts and information between the offices. So, you might make it more difficult on your patients if they need to go to a different office for some reason or another, or want to move offices, things like that. It makes it a little bit more difficult. And then, for your team, you can't centralize like scheduling as easily, and maybe some of the other things that you do. So, right, scheduling and billing are the biggest issues that you would want to centralize, and it would be a little bit more difficult to do it if you're running like completely separate practices. And so, it goes for any business, but I think when you're dealing with dental offices, there's some specific problems that come up in the practice management software and how to run that is, very particular to dental practices. So let's dive into it a little bit.
On that note, what are more of the most common problems you see with multi-location offices, particularly dental offices? But I think that maybe those kind of things can apply to any multi-location business.
One of the things that dental practices have are, large image files, things like scans of x-rays or different charts, and some of these are large data files. As internet bandwidth has increased, certainly sharing those files across the internet between locations is a little bit easier than it has in the past. So, with fiber optic internet, it is certainly much more reliable and faster than, older style connections. And so, as we move into, the higher speed internet, it allows you to share those data files across the locations a lot easier. But you still, run into some problems like depending on where you want the server, considerations of moving the server completely into the cloud, which can be more expensive, or having your dental practice software and servers running at a specific location, and then the remote locations are connected into that main location. That adds some complexity. And then the question is if that main location goes down for any reason, whether it's extended power outage or internet connection outage, then all your practices are going to go down at the same time. So, we have to build in some redundant systems to ensure that if you're relying on those connections, that they always stay up and consistent and all the locations can read the data. So that's those are some of the challenges that we come up to. So, when you're dealing as a dental practice and considering this, there's pros and cons, like I said, of going completely to the cloud for all your services, and everybody runs to that cloud location versus having that data in-house and all the locations, point to one main location.
And does sharing those kinds of files, does that bring up more of a security issue too, or anything with HIPAA compliance?
You just have to make sure that the data is encrypted in transit. So we generally look at, from a security standpoint, of encrypting the data at rest, which means when it's stored on the server, and then having it encrypted in transit. So for that type of work, we generally do VPN access, and that point to point or site to site VPN is set up very secure. We've been doing it for a long time and provides the necessary encryption so that if you're running it over the public internet, you can feel secure that that data is transmitted across the public internet securely and it's stored also securely at the remote site.
When we're talking about there's so many things that you have to think about when you're doing the IT support. So if one dental office has goes down, does that affect other locations?
Yeah, it could. So for example, if you are running servers still internally, not fully in the cloud, and the practice that is hosting that main server goes down, it could affect all the dental practices. And that, certainly is an issue. There are ways to have the data replicated to other websites, or not other websites, other sites. You want some redundancy, you could set up redundant servers at multiple sites. So one main site going down doesn't lose all the data. But then that adds a lot of complication from an IT perspective to make sure that that data is replicated across multiple sites. And that actually is a pretty complicated technology problem. In that case, if you want some insurance that the data is always available, moving to a cloud infrastructure is a little bit better because it's a little bit easier to replicate data across data centers in one cloud environment. So, moving your dental practice out to Azure, Microsoft Azure, for example, or AWS, you could have multiple servers in different data centers that are replicating, and one data center goes down, which is really highly unlikely, moved over back up to a second data center very quickly. But again, there's a cost associated with that. So just going to the cloud doesn't necessarily mean that the cost is lower. Usually it is higher because you're renting other people's hardware and other people's infrastructure. So, Microsoft wants to make money. They're a publicly traded company, and they are profitable, very profitable right now. They're going to make money off of you. And that's one of the issues of going fully to the cloud, that it does get more expensive, but it provides a certain level of security when doing that.
When you're talking with a potential client or our own clients, how do you determine like on that level what's going to be best for them, like cloud or physical backup? Or...
I think it depends on the number of sites. If we're just talking like two sites, or, one primary, and then let's say, for example, you have a primary site in your main geography, and then you have a satellite location that you visit periodically, maybe a rural location. That makes a lot more sense to have one centralized server and infrastructure in your main location, and then that satellite location just accesses it as needed. But if you're starting to think about setting up a multi-practice location across maybe dozens or more locations, moving to the cloud makes a lot more sense because it centralizes the data. You can apply consistent policies across all the locations, and then you have the high availability of the cloud. Even if it costs more, you can distribute those costs across the multiple locations. And so it's not a hugely incremental cost. It's a little bit more diluted across the multi-location. So I would say once you start, moving past three or four locations, moving to the cloud makes a lot more sense. But if you're just talking, one primary and, maybe a satellite location or two, I think it makes more sense to keep the hardware and keep it internal, and we can set up ways to get that data and make sure it's secure.
And when you're talking with a dental client, and maybe it's the office manager, maybe it's the owner, what systems are they most concerned about going down?
Well, certainly the practice management software, you can't see patients without that being up. So, and then they, need to make sure they have access to the dental records, X-ray systems. Those are, that's the critical lifeblood of dental practices is, their patient files and schedules. That's always a concern, right? If you walk in and don't know what patients you're going to see that day, all the charts are online or completely digital. how do you operate if all of that goes away? And we've seen, disaster happen that, people don't have appropriate backups or redundancy. And, suddenly they have to cancel patients for days at a time. And, you know, I, I think most dental practices are very busy. And I know for mine, if I have to reschedule an appointment, it's, 3 or 4 weeks out, or maybe even a couple of months out if I have to reschedule something. And I think most dental practices are in that same position, that if you have to, as a dental practice, cancel patients, getting them rescheduled back in is a burden on your team to ensure that you have, time and availability to do that. So we want to make sure that, the systems are running 100% of the time, that you don't ever have to cancel patients because, your systems are down or inaccessible.
And so I remember, dating myself growing up. When you're going into a dental office, they had a wall of files, physical files. So it's pretty much now it's pretty sleek in a dental in a dental office. Is everything online?
I think so for the most part. I mean, I'm sure there's some practices out there that still have paper charts or backup paper charts, but at least for the last 15 years, most practices have been moving to fully online. And it just makes things a lot more efficient. Even paper files fail, things get lost, misfiled, they could burn down. So there's, a lot of concern about those files getting lost, even if they were paper files. But certainly in a digital environment, you could take one of our ransomware podcasts, for example, and imagine walking in and all your data is under ransomware. Again, you can't see patients if that's the case. So there's certainly a lot of concerns about having those records fully online, but there's a lot of probably far more benefits to doing, a fully online practice. So we just have to make sure from an IT perspective that your data has some redundancy, some backup, and certainly a lot of data protection to ensure that you're not going to fall victim of ransomware or some other type of cybercrime.
And in our previous episode, we talked about, backups are a part of the puzzle, and the other part is getting the backups, restoring them. So when it comes to medical and dental, I imagine there's probably files that cannot be recreated ever because there are x-rays or, something that happened in the past that's not gonna you need to refer to. So how do we ensure that stuff can get restored?
So when we're talking about data backups, there are two considerations to it. One of them is high availability, which is what we've been talking about, making sure that you can run your practice all the time, and if a server goes down or some type of internet connection goes down, that there's redundancy and backup to that. Then the next question is making sure that your data is archived and offline in case of a ransomware attack or file deletion or things like that, that you have a backup or an archive that you can go to pull data, historical data as needed. And so having both of those is essential. And usually what we do is today is automate that process, that you have a server that's redundant on site that's replicating your data. So if you do have a hardware failure or some type of ransomware event to your main server, that we can have you up and running within, call it, an hour or two. But what happens if, somebody breaks into your office and steals all your equipment? How do you do that? So in that instance, we have that same data replicated into a data center that isn't offline. Once it's done copying, then that data goes offline and it's completely disconnected from your network. So if you do have a ransomware event, or if you do have, theft or fire that occurs at your location, that data can be retrieved from that archive. Now, it does take a little bit longer. Sometimes it's faster to have them load that onto a hard drive and ship it across the country than it is to download it off the internet. We're talking about a large amount of data. And so, it might take you down for a couple of days while we're rebuilding it, but it's certainly better than the scenario you just mentioned, which is losing the data, the historical data forever. So, we, again, two considerations is high availability, which means keeping your practice up and running all the time. And number two is making sure that we have snapshots of archive data that you can go back to historically and pull old data if something happens to your existing system.
And if somebody does break in and steal physical equipment, is the data in there, is there a way to keep them from able to access that?
So in that case, we ensure that the system has full drive encryption. So that goes back to the comment I made earlier about your data at rest, is making sure that that data is encrypted on the system. So without proper passwords and authentication, even if they pulled the hard drive off, nowadays it's solid state drives, but even if they pulled that out and put it in another system, they wouldn't have access to any of it without, critical passwords. And so that's a default position that we take now, is making sure that all that data is encrypted when it's stored on your servers, and there's no way to access it without the right authentication.
And so with multiple locations, are there additional HIPAA compliance considerations dental offices need to make?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, first we have to convince dentists that they are under HIPAA compliance. So the other thing is making sure that you have consistencies and standard policies across all your locations. So standard security controls, making sure that you have, user management, identity protection on all the users, things like multi-factor authentication for getting into the systems. And then we have to, as I mentioned before, we have to ensure that the data in transit is also encrypted. So ensuring that we have encrypted VPNs set up, virtual private networks set up between the locations, so that as the data transmits over the public internet, that it's encrypted and somebody can't get access to that data as it goes over the internet.
And this kind of goes for maybe the customer, the client of the dentist. What should clients ask their dentist about their security?
Wow, that's a really good question. And, unfortunately, the public doesn't ask those questions enough, I don't think. Asking about their HIPAA policy, where the data is stored, isn't necessarily a bad thing. And then, questions, especially from a billing standpoint, how they ensure security of things like social security numbers and their health information, and making sure that it's encrypted and stored securely. And then the final thing, the HIPAA requires authorization, so you can ask them how they handle release of records outside of releasing them to the patient, how they handle that and authenticate.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think most of us just assume that whoever we're seeing is following HIPAA compliance and our data is not out there, but it is something I think as people are more focused on cybersecurity and security of their information, it's probably something important for everybody to think about.
Hopefully, in the podcast, we're not making you overly paranoid, but we hope to make you a little bit more paranoid than you were before.
Yeah, cautious, cautious. Yeah. As a dental office is looking for an IT provider, what should they be looking for? What kind of questions should they ask?
I think it's essential to ask for experience with dental practices. There are some nuances, understanding how dental practices work with their practice management software, with all the office equipment that you have, x-ray systems, things like that. I think it's really important to work with a provider that has experience with medical and dental, and especially dental side, because there's, certainly some nuances there. And then, talk to them about, the practices that they would implement from a security standpoint, making sure that they are going to, put in standardized cybersecurity controls and enforcement of those, setting up the right backups and the disaster recovery plans, and working with, a compliance expert on HIPAA compliance and implementing that for dental practices. So those are some of the questions I would ask, is just from an experience standpoint, and then what type of controls and they would put in place to ensure that your data is secure and safe, and that you can operate in the event of any type of disaster.
And when a dental practice partners with us, what can they expect to happen in the first few months?
That's a great question. So, before starting with Stimulus Technologies, we do an assessment of your locations. We look at your equipment, look at how you operate, do a security assessment in your operations. And then when we're done with that, there's be an onboarding process that we would onboard all the systems and users into the systems. Once we were done with that, we'd identify, operational gaps, now that we have really an understanding of how you're working and what's going on from an IT perspective. And then you'd work with us to standardize your systems, improving the monitoring of the work that we're doing from an IT perspective, implementing potentially backups and disaster recovery plans, and documenting the process as we go along. And then over the next quarters, several quarters, we put a long-term roadmap on improving your systems and addressing any issues that might come up along the way. And then putting in an IT budget, equipment replacements, new system implementation, and ensure that your practice can operate fully all the time without any problems.
All right. Well, Nathan, thank you for that information. And if anybody is out there who is a dental practice, please, give us a call. We're happy to help and get you going on the right path.
All right, thank you everybody for joining us and have a good rest of your day and week.